Hi, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's evening. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Annie Zaleski to our At Home with Literati series in support of Duran's Reel. She will be in conversation with Kevin Smokler. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase Duran's Reel from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States, and that we are also open for in-person shopping. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Annie Zaleski is an award-winning freelance journalist, editor, and critic based in Cleveland, Ohio. Previously, she was on the staff at the Riverfront Times on Alternative Press. Her profiles, interviews, and criticism have appeared in publications such as Rolling Stone, NPR Music, The Guardian, Salon, Time, Billboard, the AV Club, and more. She also writes liner notes, including for the 2016 reissue of REM's Out of Time. Ann Arbor native Kevin Smokler is writer, documentary filmmaker, and host with a focus on popular culture. He's the author of the books Backpack America, A Love Letter to 80s Teen Movies, essay collection, Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School, and the editor of Bookmark Now, writing in Unreaderly Times. His essays and criticism have appeared in the LA Times, Salon, Fast Company, and on National Public Radio. In 2020, he directed the documentary film Vinyl Nation about the comeback of vinyl records in America. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Annie and Kevin.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks, Literati, for having us. I mean, Literati is one of my favorite bookstores in the entire world because I'm an Ann Arbor native and I was not fortunate enough to be living in Ann Arbor when Literati was around. And now it is. So I try and do as much stuff with Literati as I can. And even though I no longer live in Ann Arbor, Literati brings me back. Annie is having a quick technical issue, so she's gonna fix this up, and I will vamp for just a moment. Up, here we go. I hope those from Ann Arbor recognize my background graphic. If you do, or if you do not, like, you know what, if you do, please place the answer in the Q&A. I would love to know if you recognize where my background graphic is from, and if you have any good memories associated with it. So please go ahead and place that. Please place that in the Q&A, and we'll wait just a second until Annie comes back. I think our guest of honor is here. Fantastic. Annie, it's so good to see you, and this is a cultural summit meeting, of course, because I think this will be possibly Literati's most friendly conversation of the year, between a proud Ann Arborite and a proud Clevelander, between a proud Michigander and a proud citizen of Ohio.
But I love Ann Arbor. We go to Ann Arbor. Well, I mean, before the pandemic, we would go all the time. We'd go to the Arc and we'd go to shop. And so, yeah, I love Ann Arbor. Big fan.
Zingerman's. I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, of course. I'm jealous because, I'm shameful actually, because I have spent less time in Cleveland than you've spent in Ann Arbor. But I need to change that because I've learned about all the great things in Cleveland from you and from our friendship. I am super excited, which is part of the reason I was so excited to talk to you about this here book, which you can't really see because of my silly background. But there we go. This is Annie's book. This is a volume this is volume number 156 of the 33 1/3 series of books, which are small volumes about classic albums, deep dives into classic albums. I have a number of these, and I believe Literati, because it is a self-respecting bookstore in a musical town like Ann Arbor, has a bunch of these too. He certainly has this one from Annie. So I hope you are compelled, after hearing many great behind the scenes stories about the making of Duran's Rio, that you are compelled to pick this up. It is a fantastic read. It is head and shoulders my favorite 33 1/3 book, and I've read a lot of them. So
you're saying that.
No, I'm not just.
I paid you to say that, didn't I?
No, you absolutely did not pay me to say that. And yes, it was great. It was great in the book, in the one about DJ Shadow's introducing, which was basically someone asked one question of DJ Shadow and he riffed for 97 pages about that album. But I think this one has a lot more meat on its bones. Can we start with Why Rio? And I ask that because Rio, in the canon of great albums and in the canon of work by the band in question here, Duran Duran, is a second album, not a debut album. Usually debut albums in history we see as more important to a band's body of work than their second album. And also their biggest hits do not come from Rio. They come from the album that follows Rio. So tell us why Rio? Why did you pitch Rio as the album you wanted to write a book about?
I mean, it is so interesting that, I think Duran Duran's debut is special in its own way. They were kind of figuring out how to play together. They'd basically been a band, like less than a year when they made that record. And so Rio, they figured out how kind of to interact with each other. They figured out their groove. They figured out how everyone kind of worked together as a band. And so their songwriting, it was heads and shoulders above their debut album. They would just really, everyone was kind of firing on all cylinders. Everyone was kind of moving in the same direction. They were free enough to kind of experiment a little bit and, kind of do some cool, studio things. So that's one thing. Second off, even though that they had their biggest US hits on other records, this record has some of their like most famous beloved songs, Hungry Like the Wolf and Rio and Save a Prayer. It's so funny how many times you talk to people and they're like, what's your favorite Duran Duran song? And they'll say Save a Prayer. So there's a lot of really sentimental favorites on this. And also just the record, the culture around it. I mean, you have other music videos. We're just on this record, we're just really kind of set them on a path to being kind of video mavens. And so, there's that as well. So there's some kind of interesting cultural talk about MTV and things like that. So there's just kind of a lot of just little tendrils, I guess, cultural tendrils, I guess we'll say, off of this album.
We will definitely get to the videos because this month we are commemorating MTV's 40th birthday, which of course began on August 1st, 1981. Because we're beginning at beginnings, could you tell us, you go into this in the book, but could we have a quick summary as to the beginnings of Duran Duran? Because I think the two things that were immediate revelations for me reading this book is Duran Duran does not come geographically where you think they might come from, and they were not founded by the members of the band that typically are the people who start a band. So can we fit those two things into the origin story of Duran Duran?
Yes, and I should say that first chapter you referenced there was a very longer first draft of that chapter, and I was suggested I cut it down a little bit, so I did. So I mean, basically, long and the short of it is they were childhood friends, John Taylor and Nick Rhodes. They basically started the band. That in 1978 they kind of coalesced. They were kind of playing a little bit together. They kind of did their art school thing, and they were from Birmingham, England, which obviously is not London, is not Liverpool. Birmingham's a kind of a different beast. They had a lot of different bands that came from there, you can't really say there's a Birmingham sound in the same way that you might say that there's kind of a Liverpool sound, Beatles.
Or a Manchester sound, yeah.
Exactly. And so they came from Birmingham. And so they kind of cycled through different lineups and things like that until they finally found a guitarist, Andy Taylor, and they found a vocalist in Simon Le Bon. And this was kind of in 1980. So they were really kicking around trying to find their sound. They had a bunch of different people cycle in and out. And so it was July of 1980. So I guess we're just, a little over 41 years ago, they played their first show at the Rum Runner in Birmingham. It was basically the Blitz Club, the Studio 54 of Birmingham. And they did their first show there. And it was kind of, it kind of took off from there.
I love that this band was founded by the keyboardist and the bass player.
I should have said that. Yes, exactly.
Which would be like imagining the Rolling Stones being started by like Bill Wyman and like Andrew Oldham or something like that. Like they're typically not, those two instruments are typically not the driving force of a band. And I think it says something very unique about Duran Duran. And frankly, I think it is expressed in the uniqueness of their sound. It is, you go into this a lot in the book, and it is very easy in retrospect to say to say, if someone had never heard Duran Duran before, to say, well, what does Duran Duran sound like? And say, oh, well, 80s new wave or early MTV or something like that. And the truth is, like, Duran Duran musically, it is the convergence of many tributaries into a single stream. Can you talk about musically what in all the different and very diverse places the sound of Duran Duran came from?
I'm glad you said that because as I wrote my book, I kind of realized that I don't really think new wave or synth pop fits them very well as a kind of a descriptor because they were very much in the tradition of, growing up in England. They had all the amazing British bands and artists of the 70s. And so you had Roxy Music, you had David Bowie. Those were kind of the two, guiding stars for the band. But then you had Brian Eno's keyboard work. So kind of that weirdo stuff. You had the Human League. You had, and then going over they like Kraftwerk, of course, was from Germany. Lots of American music. Obviously, there's Velvet Underground and Talking Heads and Blondie and Chic. So there were just you kind of and I can't believe I forgot Japan from England as well. So there's so many different little kind of it's like every cool band you can think of, like the coolest mixtape. They all went into Duran Duran, and that's why Rio sounds so cool because they're taking bits and pieces from everything, but kind of making it their own.
I love that. I had heard it kind of floating around in the ether, but you really go into it in some depth in this book, how the band kind of defined themselves, their sound as the Sex Pistols as produced by Chic, which I think is a fairly accurate description. But on the face of it, you'd be like, okay, I can't even imagine what that would sound like. And I think it's crucial to point out the sort of and you go into this in the book really nicely, the sort of multiculturalness of their sound, particularly because we are Duran Duran was crucial to the early years of MTV. We are celebrating MTV's 40th birthday right now. And MTV famously, although they deny it to the hilt, was essentially a segregated network when they began, and it was David Bowie, an inspiration to Duran Duran, that really took them to task for doing so. We now have this very famous interview where David Bowie says to Mark Goodman, "Oh, isn't it strange that you don't seem to play black artists on MTV?" And Mark Goodman kind of fumbles with it. So, can we talk about the and a lot of this you talk about in the book comes from John Taylor and his musical interests. Can we talk about the although it's not present on the face, the kind of blackness of Duran Duran, which I think is amazing.
It is interesting because when you think, and that's, I think in some of their later records, I think come out a little bit more because obviously they started working with Nile Rodgers a little bit, who they absolutely love because of Chic. They collaborated with Bernard Edwards, and so they really wanted to be Chic, and it's so interesting because I think in America, of course, when you look at disco, that there was so much racism and homophobia. Why the way rock and disco, just the twain did not meet. And because Duran Duran was from England, I think they did not have those same biases. I mean, if you look at the British charts, you look at Top of the Pops, I mean, it's like the diversity of artists is really cool. And so that was kind of their backdrop. That's how they were kind of approaching music. They didn't have those weird, American, you need to put everything in a little box and have a little binary. You read early interviews with John Taylor and he's talking about Parliament Funkadelic, and he's talking about, the new music coming out. He's talking about Was Not Was. They were all such massive music fans. They love soul. They love Northern soul. They love Motown. They really just had such voracious musical interests. And I think we talk about this a lot, how younger generations really appreciate classic rock. They don't have the biases of maybe someone saying, oh, Journey's terrible, or, Toto's a terrible band. These are they're coming at it from, this is really cool music. We want to emulate this. And so I think that really, that made their music sound a lot different. And I think it gave their music some grooves and some soul. And they really felt freer to kind of embrace all that stuff.
That's very well put. By the way, if anybody ever says Toto is a terrible band, ask them if they are familiar with Toto's best-selling album. The answer to, and the answer to this.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah, the answer to this, this dumb joke I'm about to make. Toto's best-selling album is Thriller, because because Toto was the studio band on Michael Jackson's Thriller. So I would love for us to go a little bit more into this, because you have I think the most powerful section of this book is where you sort of within the context of reporting on the origins and making of this album, you also sort of make a case for the longevity of not only Rio, but the band itself. And the fact that the band has been kind of their impact has been minimized and demutized because of their fan base, really. Which and by the way, when people say bands get the fans they deserve. I don't always believe that. Um, and I think that's a way of minimizing bands that play music that you don't care for. But can we talk about how a good portion of the lack of historical regard for Duran Duran is essentially based on a pile of sexist nonsense?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I do go into that. I could probably write a whole book just on that part, because it's true. You look at Duran Duran's fans, they were obviously back in the early 80s, they had a massive teenage girl fan base. And, if you look throughout history, bands that teenage girls love are never given respect. I mean, you look at, Bay City Rollers, you look at, I think the Bee Gees, when they were very popular and they lost a little bit of respect. Even the early Beatles, everyone, they got cool because they kind of started experimenting, but early Beatles, they were kind of cute. So there was a little bit of a sconce. It's the whole boy band syndrome, and so I think Duran Duran was kind of seen as a boy band. They were kind of seen as this, they were just pretty faces, maybe they didn't play their own instruments, so they were really just kind of, seen as they weren't considered artists. They weren't considered, and I mean that in the sense of being experimental. People might not necessarily, their fans knew, but the greater good might not know, wow, they like all these really cool bands. They have this really good taste in music. They only maybe saw them on MTV and their music videos and thought that they were, one thing. And it was very striking, kind of just doing research and seeing so much between the music critics, some of the letters to the editor sections of newspapers, where there was just so much sneering at the band, and part of it is like, when probably jealousy. I think a lot of men were, like, these are very good looking young men and they were, getting a lot of attention, and there's probably a little bit of jealousy there. But there was just, and then Duran Duran had a pretty strong male fan base. And even the band would basically say, look, like, we have fans of both genders, of all genders, this is not just a thing, but no one wanted to listen to it. They just kind of wanted to, demonize their fans. And I think that is part of why, only until recently, I would say maybe the last decade, 15 years, people have finally started sitting up and said, hey, they're a pretty good band. Like they're really good musicians. Like these are great songs. So I think, and again, it kind of goes back to, as different biases fall away, as different generations discover the band, they come at it from a very different angle. And I think that's part of the reason why Duran Duran is getting respect now, but didn't for a very long time.
I think your research for this book is just exquisite, because it really takes something to research well and thoroughly and not have the experience for the reader be like, well, why don't I just read the bibliography then instead of the book? Like, so I'm curious. I want you to talk about your approach to this particular book and how you chose it. If this is volume 156 in the 33 and a third series, there's probably 165 different methodologies that these books have used. Everything from cultural criticism to music criticism to memoir to, there's a couple of graphic novels in there. So I'm curious about the approach that you chose, particularly to tell the story of Rio.
So a lot of the books, because the publisher is an academic publisher. And so there's a fair amount of people who are kind of professors. And so they might take a little bit more academic approach. And now that's never been me. That's just not my background. My background is in journalism. What I like doing is digging in and doing research and putting together narratives and a story. And so that's what I wanted to do. That's what I knew I wanted to do. And part of that is doing interviews. I really enjoy doing interviews anyway. So I knew, first off, I wanted to approach the band and see if they'd be willing to be interviewed for it. And they were. And I was very excited about that because I got some kind of new insights. And I kind of used that as the guiding sort of framework to kind of then do some other research and some threads to kind of explore. And so I looked at kind of older trade magazines. I looked at, older bios. I looked at websites, music, bootlegs. And so I kind of did everything I could to kind of try to put a narrative, because the whole thing about this record too is that, it wasn't a success in America at first. It was, big in England, it was big in Australia, but it took a really long time for it to become a hit in America. And so I wanted to know why. I had kind of, I had done some research, so I had kind of had some theories. So I wanted to talk to people and kind of get the story behind that too. So there was actually kind of a narrative, it was almost like writing a very long feature too. So that's what I kind of wanted to do. And because, I had a really good grounding. Duran Duran, one of their things they said early on was, when they were a band, they wanted to do 3 venues like in subsequent years. They want to do Hammersmith Odeon, Wembley Arena, then Madison Square Garden. And they actually did that. which, bands don't necessarily manifest stuff like that, but they were, they made it happen. So I was like, you know what, I think, I knew how to end, I knew where the book would end really well. So it was kind of everything in between. So there was also it was a very easy kind of organization too.
You can answer this question in a small way or a big way, but what are your favorite things to tell people about Rio in this book that you sort of think they don't know, that they're always like really delighted to find out about Rio?
It's funny because it depends on who's asking this, because if I talk to, I've heard some super fans say, wow, I learned some things. I've heard some other people say, I didn't learn anything at all. So I think it depends on who you're talking to. But I think, one of the things is I was very happy to talk to Andy Hamilton, who did the sax solo on Rio, because that is I think one of the most iconic sax solos of the 80s. So I wanted to find out, how that came together. And so that was just, Nick Rhodes told me it was very planned out. And so there was, that kind of that element, the push and pull between Andy's he said at one point that, he was in a rehearsal and he was improvising the solo, and the band was like, what are you doing? You can't do that. That's not how the solo is. And so I thought that was very funny, that it was always meant to be played in that way. So that's one of my favorite things. I really enjoyed hearing about, kind of how the graphic design came together. Malcolm Garrett, who did a lot of the early album sleeves and did a lot of the graphic design work up through the mid 80s. There was obviously the Patrick Nagel painting, but then he kind of added his touch to it, and just the way he kind of approached Rio, making it, he kind of approached the album cover like it was a cigar box, where you would kind of slice it open, because Rio was sort of this exotic thing. And I had never seen that. Obviously I've seen the records so many times. Then when he explained that to me, it's like, God, that's just brilliant, And so just talking to him, because he's such a amazing graphic design talent, just so smart and so visual in a way I could never be. So that was also very cool.
Yeah. Let's talk about the video, or the videos, I should say. It is hard to imagine Rio without the 3 videos that came from it. And I think did Russell Mulcahy direct all 3?
So he did. So it's funny because there was so My Own Way, which is on the record, was released as a single in a different form in late 81. And the band all were kind of like, yeah, this didn't work. It had disco strings and it was very frenetic. And so he directed a video for that. But it was it was very much first album. It's this weird kind of nether. If there's a bridge between Rio and their first record, it's probably that song. Gotcha. And so he kind of directed that video, and he didn't really have any strong memories of that. I did interview him, but he directed the videos for Save a Prayer and Rio and Lonely in Your Nightmare and Hungry Like the Wolf. And then a man named Ian Eames did the chauffeur, which you can kind of tell because it's a very, very different feel and style than the other ones.
Yeah, it's hard to separate the aesthetic of Russell Mulcahy, the director, how it manifests itself in the videos for Rio and Hungry Like the Wolf, and basically the entire aesthetic of the first 2 years of MTV. If there was a person who sort of patented that style, it was Russell Mulcahy and the work he did for Duran Duran.
And it's so funny you mentioned that, yeah, because you look on IMDb and, doing research and just how many videos he directed around that time. It was just, he did Ultravox's Vienna. He did so many Elton John videos. He was just really, I bet he probably had 25% of the videos on MTV at that point. And he was but he was so brilliant. He was so cinematic. He saw the potential of music video and what it could be, and worked with the right bands, before pretty much anyone else, and yeah, with Duran Duran, their management team was very ambitious and cinematic and had kind of movie ambitions. And so they're like, let's go to Sri Lanka. And everyone's like, sure, why not? And so, but Russell, they really planned it out, and he saw the potential and where everything could kind of fit together. And yeah, it's just, you really can't separate it, but what's so interesting is that you have, The ones in Sri Lanka, I think they're a little bit more evocative, and you can see, Hungry Like the Wolf's kind of an adventure video. But then you look at Rio, and which was done in Antigua, and the band was on vacation, and so it's a little bit cheekier, it's a little bit more lighthearted. There's some humor in it, and so he was also such a versatile director too. He kind of used the where he was. It wasn't just like a cookie cutter video, and I think that's part of the reason why they look so good too.
Yeah, if you've ever seen any music video from the first 10 years of MTV and seen a jungle cat walking in slow motion, that's a Russell Mulcahy video.
Yep.
That was one of his things. So I think you make a really good point there. And I actually love the section in the book where you talk about the video for Rio and how when we look, particularly that sort of iconic image of Duran Duran on the prow of the ship in those fabulous suits. And we are inclined in retrospect to say, my God, that was everything that was glorious and terrible about the early 1980s, right there, captured in one image. And I think that feels easy and pat to me. And I think you kind of really go into that nicely in the book. Can you tell everybody just a little bit about that sort of assertion I just made?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that this is like the, 80s when you think about it. It's like they're on a yacht, it's speeding, they're handsome, the wind is going through their hair.
Right. And nobody's getting wet. I don't know how that.
Exactly. It's magic. It's that muscle magic.
Yeah.
But it's like, you think about, Thatcherism, you think about Reaganism, you think about, excess, yuppies, you think about all of these things that kind of projected. The truth was Duran Duran filmed that video, I think within the first couple months after Rio came out. They were on vacation, kind of resting there. The record was a success, but they weren't a success in America yet. They were still playing clubs in America. They were still like, the first band on a bill of three. They were still trying to kind of make it. And so that video, there was a lot of, there's a lot of manifesting. There was a lot of kind of yearning. There was kind of, they were obviously enjoying themselves. I mean, who wouldn't want to be on a boat speeding, when you're from England and it's sunny and it's warm, but there was definitely a little bit of, we want this to happen. We're going to manifest this. And so it was very much like, it would be great if this would happen. And they kind of made that happen. They put on those suits. And if you can look at their promo photos and their band photos through like the end of 82 into 83, and their look changed. They became a little bit more kind of clean cut. They looked like they might be on a sitcom a little bit. Like it's definitely a little less artsy and a little bit more, for lack of a better word, 80s, and fashionable. And so it is really interesting. Like they really sort of, changed their look, and the videos kind of guided their look. It was all subconscious though. This wasn't deliberate. They weren't, trying to do anything. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah. I by the way, we're going to come up on Q&A in about 10 minutes. So if folks want to know about Rio or Duran Duran, and by the way, Annie's a friend of mine, and her knowledge extends backwards and forwards from this album. And so please, if you'd like to know anything about Duran Duran at all, beyond what is talked about in this fantastic book, please leave it in the Q&A, and we will get to it in about 10 minutes or so. Megan will come back in and let us know when it is time. I want to ask you something about, I think it's really great. I think it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite sections of the book, where you talk about how the video for Rio is an ambition. It is something that is in fact not yet happened for the band, as opposed to them luxuriating in something that has happened already. I think that's there's something kind of self-aware about that, even though they were really youngsters when this was all happening for them. Here in the present, 40 years later, who do you see as the nieces and nephews of Rio? Like where does this, if the last page of this book, and now I'm just imagining, but if the last page of this book actually said, to see what Rio hath wrought, please listen to, what would it say?
It's really interesting, because I think the Killers are an obvious one. I think you can look at, especially, Their early stuff too, but even some of their more recent stuff. It's funny that the producer that Duran Duran has been working with recently, Errol Aiken, worked on a Killers record in the last couple of years. So definitely them. You look back through time like Blur, in the 90s is very heavily Duran Duran influenced. They work with Justin Timberlake. You can see a little bit of that. Pretty much the dance punk movement of the 2000s was all Duran Duran. You kind of take your pick of that stuff. It's funny because it's the Duran Duran, the sound on Rio is so unique that it's really difficult to pinpoint, like, oh, here's a record, it sounds just like Rio, because no one has ever been able to replicate that. I think Roger Taylor, when I talked to him, he even said that he's like, no one sounds like us. Even Duran Duran, they made a record in about a decade ago, All You Need Is Now, and they worked with Mark Ronson, and Mark was like, get back to like your Rio mindset, and they kind of did, but like it was still different, and so it's just very interesting that they really captured a lightning in a bottle moment with this record. And so there's echoes of it. You can see so many different places, but they've never been able to the descendants look a lot different. The genetics works in funny ways, and so they look a lot different.
Do young folks who were not born at this time know of Rio?
Yes. And that was actually one of my most, the coolest things that I found while doing research was that they, there's so many kids that are into Duran Duran. John Taylor did a Reddit, Ask Me Anything, and it was all like younger folks in the comments asking for bass tips. There's all sorts of social media accounts that are dedicated to 80s Duran Duran, they're all obsessed with how John Taylor looked in 1982. And it's very, very funny. And I think part of it is the fact that they've had songs in commercials, they've had songs in movie trailers, they've had songs on I think The Voice maybe, and American Idol, probably both. So they've really had good a lot of people have kind of taken their songs and done different versions of it and run with it. So I think that's really helped keep them in the pop culture eye too.
Bring us into the present. There's actually plenty of news on the Duran Duran front these days. So I think I just checked their wiki. Duran Duran has 14 studio albums, folks.
Oh, yeah.
So if Duran Duran is a band you loved when you're a teenager, there's no reason that you should have gotten off the bus after Wild Boys, for example.
Right.
Or Notorious for that matter. But bring us into the present and tell us what's going on with the band right now.
It's very exciting because they have a new record out in October called Future Past, and they've released a single called Invisible, which is really interesting. It's very different. They have actually Graham Coxon from Blur playing guitar on it. It's just kind of this cool, funky space age. It's like electronic, but it's not. It's really interesting for them. They debuted another song when they were on the Today Show, which was kind of this like pulsating disco fantasia, which I love. And then they have a new single that I think is coming on Friday. It leaked today. It's called More Joy, and it's a collaboration with the Japanese kind of punk pop band called Chai. And it's really good. It's really like this. You think of a song called More Joy, it's very buoyant, it's very happy. And sometimes you have seasoned bands working with younger artists, it sounds like, you're like, it's a little bit weird but the sound, it's amazing. Like the way that they kind of merge their sound with this band is like, it sounds so cool. And so I'm so excited for this record. So that's the long and the short of it. I'm like, all right, we've heard 3 songs from it now, I'm ready. I have my pre-orders in. And so that's kind of what they're up to. And they're hoping to tour next year, which would be amazing. Hopefully with everything with the pandemic will go our way. But they're just keeping busy. They're always moving forward. I think that's one of the greatest things about Duran Duran is that they're never dwelling on the past. Obviously in concert, they have to, they can't get out the door without playing Hungry Like the Wolf for Rio.
Sure.
I think fans are Brian. But but they're always kind of moving forward and trying new things and embracing new bands. Simon Le Bon has a serious show, plays lots of new music. And so they're always really kind of pushing themselves. And I think, that really proves that they're artists. If you think about, artists and, who don't rest on their laurels, that's Duran Duran to a T.
Absolutely. I think what your book captures so beautifully is the moment when a band is sort of on the ascent and we haven't yet seen what they're capable of. I think Rio is by far like the most recognizable cover of any of the early Duran Duran albums. And I think, because of the three first albums, Rio is the only one that also has a song named the name of the album. It's easy to think like before you pick up this book that like, oh, you're capturing a band at their zenith. This was the peak. And in fact, the biggest success was yet to come, like on the next record. Talk a little bit about how you capture that unique moment in a band's history in this book.
It's so interesting because you're right. Like they were really on the precipice of something with this book. And, and this was, and, in America, especially because the album cycle was so elongated. They had Save a Prayer from the album wasn't a single until 1985 here, which was like, almost 3 years after the record came out. And so they didn't tour America in a big way until 1984. So it was kind of, after Rio finally hit, that was their sort of their big comeback. They already had Seven and the Ragged Tiger at the end of 1983. And so, that's why I kind of wanted to structure it the way I did too, kind of a build up and kind of examining, going back and looking at dates, and using billboards and using sort of radio stats to say, let's trace the success. That's the one nice thing about a lot of the radio, when radio was dominant back in the day, was that you could actually sit there and, do like even a graph and say, all right, here's how the song goes up and down. And you can really see the patterns and you can see how the band kind of did become a success. And so having that's how I kind of traced it with that, so I think I did a whole chapter after Rio hit with, 1983 was the big year for them. 1983 was when in America, especially, they had 4 top 20 hits. They had 3 hit albums. They had videos everywhere. They were on Saturday Night Live, and they were that was like their year, and they were away for most of it, recording a record. And so I kind of use that as sort of the pivot point, just to kind of show, it's hard now to think of a band because music is so different now. That's so dominant and so omnipresent, but they really were at that point. They were in dance clubs, they were on TV, they were on the radio. And so I really tried to convey that, just kind of giving different examples of like, hey, they're on Casey Kasem's Countdown. They did a in-store in Times Square and drew like 5,000 people. The police were like having to, try to barricade, things. People were getting hurt, so just kind of using examples and then just sort of, a timeline just to kind of show, hey, they really, really grew in that time.
The Duran Duran has a couple of things going for them that really, historically ensure a band's longevity. They were childhood friends, but not genetic brothers. That for some reason, brother, that usually means a band will self-destruct.
Yes.
And even though they had enormous success and when they were relatively young, well, they were very young actually. 40 years later, they have 4 of the 5 original members still in the band. So how much do we attribute those things, which are, we could say are hard evidence or really just points of music trivia, but how much do we attribute those things to the fact that here we are 40 years later, about to get a new Duran Duran release, and they're not, and they're sort of still doing it on their own terms. They're not going to be playing the oldies circuit or showing up at a Six Flags amusement park near you. I mean, this is
exactly. And I think that's a really good point, and I think, and you look at it and they're still friends. It's just very obvious. They were on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen earlier this week. And, which of course is a TV show that's very lighthearted. And Andy asks all sorts of, embarrassing questions and probing questions, but also funny questions. And, it was like they were, joking around with each other, Simon's nickname is Charlie, and so they're like, using his nickname, and, he's asking embarrassing questions. They're all kind of joking with each other. They still have affection for each other. And you can tell that. And that makes such a difference when you're a band and you've been together that long. There's a lot of love and just, and obviously, and they've talked about in the past, like with they're like a family, and like with any family, of course, you're going to have disagreements, and you're going to, someone's not going to like something, and you're going to, get little fights. But then you can just tell that there's that underlying, we like working with one another. Like all personalities are all different, but they all fit together. And I think that also has a lot to do with their longevity. And, they're all kind of in agreement on, this is what we want to do. This is, I think if one band member was like, no, let's just do the oldies circuit, I don't want to do any new music, and then everyone else was like, come on, you'd see a breakup, because you see that, how many times do you see that, when you have,
Yeah.
People just like are like, yeah, I don't like what we're doing here. I'm still feeling creative, and I'm still feeling vibrant. And you can tell that every member of Duran Duran still feels that, and even though they'll even joke, they're like, oh, it takes us forever to make a record now, which is true. They'll be the first ones to tell you that, but they're perfectionists too. And I think they still care about the band, and they still care about their music. And I think that also makes a difference, because a lot of bands, they get tired. If you've been together for 40 years, you're like, we're just going to kind of, we're going to do a greatest hits record and put out a couple new songs, and that's it. But they still really value the idea of the album. It's a very old fashioned thing that they grew up listening to record albums. So that's still important to them. And so you could tell that their priorities are also kind of aligned still. And that makes a big difference.
I don't remember if it was Joe Elliott from Def Leppard or Klaus Meine from the Scorpions, but an interviewer basically asked them what touring was like now versus touring 40 years ago. And I think the interviewer desperately hoped there were still stories of backstage debauchery and groupies and stuff like that. And either Klaus Meine or Joe Elliott answered the question basically like, used to be we played the concert so we could have the party afterwards. Now we play the concert and it's like straight to bed because I got to work out with the trainer in the morning, and I got to get a massage, and I got to drink green juice, and I got to like there's a whole, it's just a different endeavor when you're a middle-aged musician than when you're a young musician. And that goes for recording and writing and touring and all the different parts of, like, it's not a young person's game. And to succeed at it for as long as they have. Maybe someone in the audience will want to ask the why not Duran Duran in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame yet question. I'm not going to bother Annie with that particular question, but that one is open. I'm leaving that one to the audience. Instead, the question I'm going to ask leading us into Q&A is you have a book coming out, or working on a book. Your next book is going to be about the B-52s. And I think there is a similar way in which the B-52s are misunderstood as a band. So I'd like you to talk about that and maybe give us a little preview of what is going to be in the B-52s book.
It's so funny that last year I was kind of working on both books simultaneously, and there are so many parallels between the bands. I mean, I think a lot of people just think the B-52s are kind of this kitschy band that, doesn't really say much, and they're just sort of, goofy, and that's really it, and there's a lot of interesting depth. I mean, first off, their early music, especially because of Ricky Wilson, is completely like, no one can figure out how to play it because he was such a genius, unorthodox guitar player. And so there's a little bit of that. And so, I think people now are like, wow, that's really cool. And so now people are seeing the musicianship in them. So I mean, that's one aspect, but just, they're so visual. I mean, they were like Duran Duran, they knew how to kind of work the visual angle, and, and they didn't have as many videos as Duran Duran, but they were just very striking. And they took their influences, like Duran Duran, they have so many influences. My God, you could do, it's like a patchwork quilt almost together. And they really kind of put them together in really interesting ways. And so I'm kind of looking at the artistic, the cultural impact, the thematic impact, where they are now, where they were then. And so it's really interesting. I think the biggest difference is that the B-52s really, I mean, in the last 30 years have made one record, basically. Yeah, I mean, so it was Funplex, which is a fantastic record. It's very underrated. But they're just not, they're in a different place in Duran Duran, and that they are kind of playing the oldies circuit. That's not bad. They were at Riot Fest a few years ago. They drew an amazingly huge crowd. But they're just, they're creative bent. It's different now. And so, yeah, so that's a little bit more challenging. And that's a big difference from Duran Duran. But yeah, it's fascinating diving into that band too, and everything that they're about.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Eric Idle or John Cleese said, like, those guys get asked about a Monty Python reunion about once a month, and the answer they usually give is it's just hard to get us all in the same room. Like we're all
Yeah.
we're all because that's and I think what that means, the unspoken message to that is like us all in the same room is sort of who we were as young people. It's not who we are now. And maybe the B-52s still feel that way, but it's clear Duran Duran does not. It's clear like them all being in the same room is the engine behind their creativity. And
That's exactly it. I think the B-52s, they're all older. I mean, you don't realize like Kate Pearson is over 70. I mean, so she is,
oh my God.
Yeah. So they're a little bit older too. They were a little bit older when the band started. And so, I think that's a factor too, that, they just, there's different priorities, and I mean, obviously her voice is still incredible.
Yeah.
Like she hasn't, like, you listen to her sing and it's just like you want to cry because it's so beautiful sometimes. But it's very different. And you're right, Duran Duran still have that old fashioned thing. They want to get in the studio. They want to, tinker around. They want to, bounce ideas back and forth. They like being together. And I think that's a really good observation. I think that is kind of the biggest difference between them and a lot of other bands.
Yeah, well, I can't wait for this B-52s book. They're a band that I am only beginning to get to know, and I mean so I'm eager to read this book of yours, and I cannot recommend this one enough. This look at Rio, because you'll tear through it, but you really feel like you've had a complete meal. It is not the kind of book you tear through and you'll be like, what just happened? Thank you, Annie. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming to Michigan, at least virtually, to do this. And I'm really glad to hear, and I think everybody in the room is really glad to hear that you, as a native of Ohio, are a big fan of Ann Arbor. Anything to produce cultural exchange between our two states, and to see this meaningless rivalry for exactly what it is. Meaningless is a good thing. I want to make sure we get to some of the questions in the room. First one comes from Diane. She says she has a comment about critics and their perception of Duran Duran as a boy band. She edited a teen magazine between 82 and 84, wrote a bunch about Duran Duran, and found out at first they were extremely accessible to publications like hers. And then around October 83, they changed. And the feeling was that Duran Duran did not want to be perceived as a teeny bopper band anymore, because it would hurt their long-term career potential. And what Diane says is, it turns out they're still around and still doing just fine. And she would just like to say to the band that publications like hers and journalists like hers didn't hurt their career at all.
That's great. I think that's so interesting because when you look at like all of the online and the archival teen magazine stuff, it is like overwhelming avalanche in starting, especially in America, about 83. And then by 84, the stuff that's kind of being put out there's a lot of photos, not as much text maybe. And so you can kind of tell that you're not getting exclusive stuff. And I think that dovetails pretty, that basically aligns perfectly with Seven and the Ragged Tiger, which was definitely a darker record and, was a little bit more experimental. That's when they worked with Nile on the reissue or the remix of the Reflex, so they definitely wanted to be taken, and Sing Blue Silver Tour, of course, was very elaborate. And I think they did want to be taken more seriously. And, and I think that's a very common theme. And I think that they were probably tired of critics and tired of people being jerks to them. I mean, if you look, it's very sad how many articles, from back in the day you read, and people are genuinely mean. Like they just basically think that they're these, just these like, vapid people. And, as you see any interview they're doing now, it's like, John Taylor could have been a really good rock critic. Actually, he's extremely perceptive when he's talking about music and interviewing people. He interviewed their guitarist Don Brown, and just a really great Q&A, and so they're all just very, and even when I interviewed them, that's the one thing that struck me, is that they're so good about analyzing kind of Duran Duran and the band, but they're also really good about placing it in cultural context. And you don't necessarily interview a lot of people who have that perspective. So they have really good inward perspective and also outward perspective. And so, that doesn't surprise me at all, honestly. And you're right, it didn't hurt their career because all of the fans who saw them in teen magazines are still supporting them.
It's true. It's true. Their trajectory was much more like the Beatles and or the Bee Gees and or the Rolling Stones and much less like the Bay City Rollers. Like, um, the so I I'm curious, if nobody's gonna ask the Rock Hall question, I'll ask the Rock Hall question. What have Duran Duran's prospects been? What do we see as their chances in the near future? And of course, this is all within the context of the brand new sort of voting mechanism at the Rock Hall. This is the first year that the Rock Hall has opened up a category called very, very vaguely and euphemistically put musical excellence, which has basically become the sort of budget reconciliation category of the Rock Hall, where it's like if you want someone to get into the hall, but you don't want to put it to the membership, which largely votes for like 60-year-old white men playing guitars, you induct them in the musical excellence category. So given all of that, what do we see as the prospects for Duran Duran and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, based exactly where you live, in Cleveland, Ohio, in the near future?
So here's I think let's do two things here. So first off, there is no doubt that Duran Duran belongs in the Rock Hall. I mean, I think induction is like, is influence, impact. I mean, they have it
sales,
everything. They're good, and so, and the fact that, you would think that because, in recent years, Roxy Music has gotten in, which of course, I mean, Simon and John inducted Roxy Music, that they've gotten in, Depeche Mode have gotten in, The Cure have gotten in, the Rock Hall has finally kind of decided, and the Go-Go's are getting in this year, hey, New Wave. New Wave's pretty cool. New Wave is pretty influential.
That's a thing,
80s rock, so I think they're starting to kind of come around a little bit to the impact of that. So, I mean, that's a point in Duran Duran's favor. The thing that's not in their favor is that kind of what we've been talking about, is that there's a lot of older men voters now, I think, still, because I think the way the voting works is that, they have, people who are inducted vote. And, I think that they definitely get respect from some of the younger artists, and they get, respect from, I think, some of their peers as well, from, in the rock stars they've met in England. There's still a lot of people who just still think that they're just some boy band, that just really don't see their artistry, don't necessarily see that they do deserve to be in there. They're just kind of seen as these like pretty boys. And so I think that's one of the kind of the strikes against them. I mean, because they've never been nominated, that doesn't mean they won't be nominated soon, but they really should be, I mean, it's just, I think everyone is sort of like, come on, like that's one of the biggest glaring omissions, of recent times about Duran Duran. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see in the coming years, because I mean, I think the new Rock Hall Foundation president, John Sykes, worked at MTV in 81. And so obviously he knew exactly the impact of Duran Duran. I don't know anything about the inner workings of the Rock Hall, any of the nominating mechanisms, but, potentially something, who knows. But it'll be interesting to see, because I think, hopefully some of this kind of cultural context and excitement will start to bleed over into that.
We've already seen the precedent set by both the Grammys and the Academy, the Motion Picture Academy. Hopefully we haven't really seen it at the Rock Hall yet, but this idea that these institutions have a lot of making up ground to do in terms of diversity by whom they induct and who they consider worthy of induction. Hopefully that will find its way over to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame soon enough. And also we have, in very recent memory, we have members of the nominating committee being vocal about whom they have championed and campaigned for. When Janet Jackson was inducted a couple of years ago, she was very clear that Questlove had been sort of at the pointy end of the spear in championing her induction. So I think like my hope is all of this bodes well for bands like Duran Duran, who we dismiss because the people that made them famous were teenage girls. Never mind, those were the same people who made the Beatles and the Rolling Stones famous. But we have that undue weight has Duran Duran has carried for 40 years now. And I hope they, I hope it is rectified, and they are given their what they deserve, going on.
Absolutely. We should see if Questlove's Duran Duran fan. I don't know. We should almost he's the guy that we need to start campaigning for. Like, forget all this other stuff. We need to start poking him.
Absolutely. I mean, I think before Janet Jackson, he was responsible for Daryl Hall and John Oates getting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and of course that was a big wave of Philadelphia pride. We know why that happened, but like, Annie, final words. Like, is there for someone who sees this book or hears you speak in a venue like this, and mostly thinks of Duran Duran as a really pleasant memory they have from junior high or from high school or something like that? What do you say to that person here in the present?
I would say revisit the record. One of the things that's been really interesting is just hearing from fans, just that they maybe hadn't listened to Rio in a while, and they picked up my book and said, oh, I think I'll give it a listen again and a spin. And, they had different memories of it. And it brought back really fond memories. I think it's a record that really grows with you. I think it was very, obviously I started listening to this when I was a teenager. And then when kind of doing this book as an adult, it was really interesting. I heard different things. I heard different turns of phrase in a different way. I had a different perspective on the record. And I think it's a record that really grows with you. And I think part of the reason why it is still so popular is that, it's a darker record. It's a kind of a moodier record. There's definitely some, different, like more adult, sophisticated edges. It's a lot more. And I think this is even, one of the band members told me this, this is like, it's not a teen record. It's not a record geared toward teenagers. There's definitely a lot of, adult things in there. There's kind of some moodiness. And so I think it's one of those records that you can really relate to when you get older as well. And so I think I would revisit it. If you only thought of it as that, oh, this is that goofy album I liked as a teenager, I'd give it another spin and just kind of see what your thoughts are. Maybe you'll still think it's goofy, but maybe you find something different or something new to love, or you'll hear something in a new way.
If you do so, please pick up a used copy or a new copy if it's been re-released at any of the fine record stores in Ann Arbor. School Kids sadly no longer exists, but of course Underground Sounds and Encore Recordings and many of the great record stores on Liberty Avenue downtown still exist. And please pick up a copy of this fantastic book at Literati, one of the great bookstores in America, but also one of the crown jewel of book selling in Ann Arbor. Annie, thank you so much. It was really great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin and Annie, for joining us for Literati at Home. And yes, again, reminder, buy Duran Duran Real. But thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Good night.
you.